Hello, everyone. I want to thank you all for coming. This event started with a coffee meeting with my friend Jessica Jablon, who's working for Sharsheret. She told me about these pink Challah events that Sharsheret holds to bring more awareness to breast cancer. I thought it was a great idea, and I agreed to host 15 to 18 ladies at my home. And then I spoke to Hannah. I'm like, please, can you come speak at my event? That would be so great. And she said, oh my gosh, I was actually just thinking about how I've always wanted to host a Challah bake here at Encino Chabad. We should definitely join forces so we can host more women and create even more awareness. Great, but now I need to find a medical expert to speak to us. Who could I find? No joke, he did not come to mind. He's so busy. I'm thinking, I know a geneticist on my street. Maybe she would come. Who else do I know? God, let me think. Oh, I know, I should definitely check to see if Richard's in town so he could babysit. Who's gonna watch my kids? And then, of course, I got the aha moment. Richard, oh my gosh, he totally has to speak. My amazing husband, an oncologist at UCLA, who has helped develop new breast cancer drugs that are helping women all around the world live longer. Of course, once Richard came to my mind, that was it. The event was sealed. So without further ado, I introduce to you Dr. Richard Finn.
We're still negotiating my honorarium. But thank you very much to Sharsheret, Jessica, to Adina and Rebbe for asking me to be here. I've spoken a lot, but I've never spoken to such a nice audience, looking out and seeing all these beautiful Jewish women dressed in pink from my own community here in Encino. And especially to be here to the Gordon family. I'm sure your father is looking down with smiles to see the impact you're having in your local community. My mother-in-law is here too. That's very special too. But, I was asked Adina, what I should speak about, and I think a few things to cover, and partly, I think, to start with the facts, and Jessica spoke about them a little bit. Breast cancer is a very common disease, right? Many of you have been touched by it, or you know someone who's touched by it, but it doesn't need to be a scary disease, right? For one, you have your community and resources, but breast cancer is very curable. It's a very curable disease. It's common in that it's about the most common malignancy in women, and there's about over 250,000 cases in the United States, but the majority of women are cured of their disease, fortunately. They're cured of their disease because of a combination of factors. One of them, they're found early, so screening is important. You can't deny this is a real problem. Denying the problem just hides it, and it doesn't help anything. This isn't like, I don't want to get my flu shot because I never get the flu. This is different, because an early intervention can mean life or death for people. And it is curable, and sometimes treatment can be intense, right? And that's, again, where having your support is important. So get a mammogram. You learned about that in the United States, about 1 in 8 women will get breast cancer, and in the Jewish population, it's a little higher than that. And it's a little higher than that because of the increased frequency of the BRCA mutations. So BRCA was a gene that was identified in the early 90s in families that had a very strong history of breast cancer, and actually someone at UC Berkeley played a very key role in that, Mary Claire King. And they identified a gene and subsequently another gene that was associated with high-risk breast cancer. These BRCA genes prevent breast cancer. So when you lose them, or they're mutated, that increases your risk. And for patients who are at risk, you need to have a high degree of surveillance, and that goes for every woman, but also specifically for Ashkenazi Jewish women. And if you have a family history of breast cancer, you need to talk to your doctor about maybe speaking with a genetic counselor. And again, the biggest impact this will have is getting mammograms or screening MRIs and finding the disease early. Even with all the recommendations, you're not going to find everybody, right? Because there's even controversy about when to start mammograms. The American Cancer Society says definitely by 45, and for some women, if they decide to do it, to start even earlier at 40. And you say, well, why not get a mammogram? What's the risk, right? And it's a safe procedure, but a certain percentage of things that show up on a mammogram are not going to be cancer. And it's stressful to get a mammogram, it's stressful to have the radiologist say there's something there, it's stressful to get a biopsy, but that is weighed against the benefit of finding an early malignancy. So that is one of the reasons why women are living longer with breast cancer. And the other big contributing factor is improving treatments. And, you know, there's no one-size-fits-all approach to treating cancer, specifically breast cancer. We've learned over time that breast cancer is not one disease, right? To digress a little bit, I am here today, truly, I believe, because God played a role in my life to bring me here. And many of you know this, and I mention this in the context of not one disease, you'll see the connection soon. But, I was a senior in high school in the South Bay, grew up in Torrance, and my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer actually when I was like 3 or 4 years old, right? And none of us knew that, except my dad, obviously. And she kept it very quiet because she didn't want us to worry, a very typical Jewish mother. But also think about how we talked about the C word in the 70s. Things have changed dramatically. They would not be doing a holiday in the early 70s. It wasn't talked about, if many of you remember All in the Family, right? You remember that show, right? There was a big episode when Edith had cancer in the 70s. And it was a big step forward to talk about it on national television, right? To raise awareness, just like you're doing here tonight. And she did well for a very long period of time, but the disease did come back. And by that time, I was a senior in high school. I have an older sister who was already in medical school, and an older brother who was not in medicine. And I was going to be an engineer. I did not want any part of medicine, right? I saw what my sister was doing, my brother-in-law, a lot of work, a lot of debt. I think I was going to take a much more secure track and become an engineer like my dad. And then my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer, and it was advanced, and they could no longer keep it from me. There were days that I would come home from working at the drug emporium, a drugstore in high school, and my mother was very sick and nauseated and flushed. That's what was going on, right? Oh, it's menopause or something. I was a very innocent kid, but it was because she was getting chemotherapy. And that summer between high school and college, I spent a lot of time with my mom, taking her to appointments. My dad was working, my sister was in medical school, my brother was already working, and I was truly inspired by the doctors who were taking care of her. She was seeing a radiation oncologist at the time at Cedars, who's long retired, but seeing how he cared for her and helping her, and that's where a switch went off in my head, and I said, maybe I should think about medicine. I was very much interested in science, right? And I ended up going to UC San Diego, and I remember vividly, the day that I turned around in my room, I was studying for finals, and my brother and his best friend were there to tell me that my mother had passed. That is when I said, maybe I need to go into medicine, right? I was inspired by this doctor, and if you think about where cancer medicine was in the 80s, right? In the late 80s, it was chemotherapy, right? There was a drug called tamoxifen, which has made a huge impact in certain types of breast cancer, but it was chemo. And so I transferred to UCLA to finish my undergraduate, to be closer to home. And it's funny, as an undergrad, I was living at the UJ, right? I was from Torrance, the South Bay, never came up to the West Side or the Valley, never heard of the Valley. Maybe there was a dance once in a while I would come up to. You know, we were living at the UJ, and if we were hungry, we'd go to Jerry's Deli to get ice cream or something, because there's nothing else. And never would I have thought that I'd be living here so close to Jerry's. I don't go there anymore. But in this neighborhood, and it's a very interesting connection. In fact, I studied for the MCAT at Kaplan, which used to be like a few doors down, right next to Office Depot. But anyways, I digress. So I transferred to UCLA, and I was interested in cancer research, and at that time, a very novel alteration was discovered by now a longtime colleague, my mentor, and still my boss, Dennis Slayman. You know, he had identified that about 25% of breast cancers had extra copies of a gene called HER2. And at the time, they were trying to figure out what it did in breast cancer. Could they exploit this for cancer treatment? And I had an amazing experience in the lab, because it turned out 25% of women had extra copies of this gene, and those who had extra copies did worse. And at the time, they were pursuing new treatments for this. And as some of you may know, it's been in the news recently, because recently Dr. Slayman won a very prestigious award, one of many, probably a prelude to the Nobel Prize. But, you know, the molecules we were working on in the lab eventually became a drug, Herceptin, which has dramatically changed the management for 25% of women with breast cancer. Right? But it started to reframe this discussion that breast cancer isn't one disease, right? And that each breast cancer is different, and the treatment has to be different. And over the next several years, other drugs were developed, and it became very clear that breast cancer is really at least 3 diseases. There's HER2 positive breast cancer that should be treated with drugs like Herceptin. Then there's estrogen receptor positive breast cancer, which historically been treated by drugs like tamoxifen, and then other ways to harness the dependence on estrogen. And then there's this group, which maybe you've heard about, the triple negative breast cancers. They don't have estrogen receptor, progesterone receptor, or HER2. And they have been a challenge, but that is changing as well. And I ended up going to USC for medical school, and then I came back very naturally to UCLA in 1997, where I've been since, initially doing my internship, residency, and fellowship. And, you know, my interest has always been to develop new drugs, to take this paradigm that you could understand the biology of a tumor and therefore develop better drugs. Chemotherapy, at the end of the day, is poison, right? It has no benefit, you know, for its effect on cancer cells versus normal cells. It kills more of them than the other, but it has side effects, as many of you know. And can't we do better by harnessing the biology? And, you know, when I joined the faculty, I was still working with Dennis, and while I had other interests, I always had an interest in breast cancer, because that's why I became a medical oncologist. And people say, oh, how do you become a medical oncologist? Well, you know, it is a very serious business, but there's nothing more satisfying than helping people do better, even when it can be a very serious challenge. And, you know, my work in the lab, you know, and again, led me on a certain path that I was working with my colleagues at UCLA, and we were evaluating a lot of different drugs to see if they work in breast cancer, and through some lab work, we identified, in working with Pfizer, a molecule that had been on the shelf at Pfizer for some time called PD033291. And very interesting, in our lab studies, it turned out that this drug worked preferentially for ER-positive breast cancer in cell lines. But with that, we said, well, maybe we should start to do a clinical study. And that led to what's called a phase 1 study. And Janet Klein, who you'll hear from soon, was enrolled on this study for patients who had advanced ER-positive breast cancer, and they were given PD033291, which subsequently became palbociclib and is marketed now as Ibrance. There's other drugs similar to it that have now been globally approved for the treatment of ER-positive breast cancer, and has really changed the natural history of that disease. Even a story that started for me 10 years ago is now being proven to extend survival in women, and has, again, like Herceptin, started to change the natural history of breast cancer. And while we're using it now in advanced disease, just like Herceptin is now being used in early stage breast cancer and is overwhelmingly curing women with that subtype of disease, which historically was the worst type of breast cancer and now has one of the best prognoses. And similarly, ER-positive breast cancer, while the overwhelming majority of women are cured with that disease, still some of them come back. And now there's drugs like Ibrance and similar drugs that are going to be used in early stage breast cancer and hopefully will also help cure that disease. And also with the possibility of removing chemotherapy from the management of breast cancer. I mean, that I think is a big goal for all of us, to de-escalate. Because so many women get treated with chemotherapy who might not need it. And things have gotten better in predicting who might benefit. There's been a lot of technological changes, and understanding cancer genetics have improved that. We still have this triple negative group, which has been a challenge because they don't have estrogen receptor to target or HER2 to target. But only in the past few years, for women with BRCA mutations, there's been a group of drugs developed that inhibit an enzyme called PARP, PARP inhibitors, and there's a group of them now that are FDA approved for BRCA mutated breast cancers, as well as other malignancies that carry these mutations and will be now studied in early stage breast cancer. And in fact, one of them, the lead author, was an Israeli clinician, because if you're looking for women with BRCA mutated breast cancers, you go to where there's a lot of Ashkenazi Jews. Other than Encino, there's Israel. But, someone, I think Hannah uses the word inspiration earlier, and I think that's part of, I can talk science for hours, right? But part of it, I think the story is very inspirational to me and hopefully to others. I mean, again, we talk about, how life takes us places. And Janet was a patient on the phase 1 study who was enrolled on the study by a colleague of mine, Sarah Hurwitz, who was one of 12 women who went on to this study not knowing what to expect, right? It was a new drug. It had somewhat unknown side effects, and really we did not know it was going to work. And she'll tell you that story, but from that phase 1 study, it led to a phase 2 and subsequently a phase 3 study. And again, I've been very blessed to travel a lot, and there are people like Janet all over. We have a very close friend who came to see me from Panama. Her husband was a US trained physician. His wife was 41. She was diagnosed with advanced breast cancer and was looking for something new. He went to another cancer center, and a very prestigious one in Houston, Texas, I won't name, and they said, go to Panama, we don't have anything special here. But, he found me. As it turns out, her husband and I have the same birthday. It's very bizarre. And like Janet, thank God she's done very well. She came in on a phase 3 study, so she did not know she was going to get the active drug. There was a 33% chance she would not get the real drug, yet she came every month for years on study. But over time we knew she was probably getting the active drug, and once the drug was approved in Panama, she doesn't come and see me other than socially. But I'm gonna pass it on to Janet, but before I go, the thing, if there's one person who gets a mammogram out of this crowd who otherwise wouldn't have, then that would be a success, I think, for tonight. But hopefully it'll be more than one, because as sobering as it is, someone in here is going to get breast cancer. It's just a fact. But that doesn't have to be as scary as it sounds, because when it's found early, it's very curable, and patients can do very well, and you have this beautiful community to help you. And I think Janet has spoken a lot all over, because she's very inspiring as well. So Janet and I, I've seen Janet intermittently, certainly when she was on study, when my colleague was out, and I think Janet and I are connected, right? And I want to end with this story. I travel a lot, and when I'm away for Shabbat, I try to hook up with the local Chabad. So I was in Brussels, very nice guy. Brussels, not the most Jewish-friendly city. But he said, I don't know why God sent me here, but maybe I'm here for you to, take care of you on the Shabbat. And when I met Janet, that always resonated with me. And I meet people like Janet, and I think maybe I was just put here for you, Janet, so, you should do so well. So I'll now pass it off to her.
Thank you.